Hi everyone, my name's Andrew Moore, and along with Yi Yang, we co-chair the SIR Resident Fellow Section International Outreach Committee. In accordance with one of our committee's missions to educate and provide resources for domestic and international students, residents, and fellows interested in IR training in the U.S., we've organized today's webinar titled Intro to IR Periodicals, panel discussion with editors of top IR publications. We have a great host and a great panel for today's discussion. We hope it'll be helpful and informative to all of you. Please note that tonight's session will be recorded and uploaded to the RFS website and YouTube account for future viewing and reference. The format of tonight's discussion will start with an interview between our host and our panel of candidates, which should last approximately 45 minutes. We'll then open it up as a question and answer session for the audience. Please note that you won't be able to ask your question verbally on the webinar platform, but you should instead type your question in the control panel questions section, and we'll read them to the panelists near the end of our webinar. As you think of a question during the discussion, just type it in and we'll reference those at the end as they become collected. Yi and I will provide our email addresses in the chat bar for people's reference should you have any follow-up questions or communications. Your questions are important to us. From previous webinars, there were several questions asking about how IMGs can approach finding research opportunities. One of our members, Julian McDonald, has created a how-to guide that we plan to post online when our committee website is next updated. We hope this webinar will help deepen your understanding of the research and process for publication. We also want to emphasize that these journals are excellent educational resources as well. Also, before getting started, we definitely want to thank Tommy and Ahmed, the RFS communications co-chairs, for helping facilitate this webinar and for staying on with us in the background to help with any issues that may arise. With that said, I'll introduce our host and we can get going. Our host for this evening's conversation is a member of our International Outreach Committee, the accomplished and excellent Dr. Monica Matsumoto. Monica is currently a PGY1 integrated IRDR resident at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been a great contributor to our committee this year, an excellent addition, has put a lot of hard work into organizing this evening's discussion. We hope it proves valuable for current and future IR trainees interested in academic publishing. With that said, we will go ahead and hand it over to Monica to panelists and start tonight's discussion. Take it away, Monica.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm thankful and very happy to introduce you all to the panelists tonight. As we said, hope this webinar is fruitful for everyone who's joining us. So I'll start off with introducing Dr. Haskell. He's been the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Vascular and Interventional Radiology, which is the official journal of SIR since 2011. It is one of the top-ranked, or if not the top-ranked, IR journal. Dr. Haskell himself has participated in research extensively, published hundreds of papers. He received his MD at Boston University, did his residency and fellowship at University of California in San Francisco, and is currently a professor of radiology at University of Virginia. Dr. Kaufman is the editor of Techniques in Vascular and Interventional Radiology. He's the past president of SIR and also received the SIR Gold Medal in 2018. He received his MD from Boston University, completed residency at University of Pennsylvania, and fellowship at Boston City Hospital. He is a professor of interventional radiology at Oregon Health and Science University, as well as a director of the Daughter Interventional Institute. Next, we have Dr. Charles Ray, the editor-in-chief of Seminars in Interventional Radiology. He has published, again, hundreds of papers and is also a past president of SIR. He completed his MD at Rush Medical College, did residency at University of Illinois at Chicago, and fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is professor of radiology and chair of the department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Next, we have Dr. Raj Pyne. He is the editor of IR Quarterly. This is a SIR publication issued 4 times yearly. He also leads the SIR's Private Practice Advisory Committee and is heavily involved in residency education. He earned his MD from Albany Medical College, completed his residency at St. Vincent's Medical Center in New York, and fellowship at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He is the IR Residency Program Director at Rochester Radiology Associates in Rochester, New York, and the Medical Director of the Vane Institute. And then next we have Dr. Jeffrey Klein. He is the editor of RadioGraphics, one of the premier education journals in radiology, and created by the Radiological Society of North America. He is an expert in lung cancer staging and detection, and is a former president of the Society of Thoracic Radiology. He completed his MD at State University of New York Health Downstate Medical Center, residency at SUNY King's County Hospital Center in Brooklyn and fellowship in thoracic radiology at UC San Francisco. He is professor of radiology at the University of Vermont, including director of thoracic radiology. So please join me in welcoming these esteemed panelists to the webinar. And we will get right into the questions. So if you could each briefly introduce your periodical publication, mission and uniqueness in the radiology and IR community. And then we will that will help give us a global understanding of what sort of articles you publish and usefulness to the trainees here. So why don't we start with Dr. Haskell?
Thank you so much, and this is really a wonderful event. I've never been on such a panel like this, so it really is. I'm going to learn a lot. The JVR is a primary society journal of the SIR, so it is this year 30 years old since Gary Becker essentially created it and was its first founding editor. We're the primary science journal for primary research, but at the same time, the journal hosts the societal statements, its position statements, its guidelines, and then has been a home to a whole variety of kinds of papers, from lighter reading to opportunities for new authors to break into publishing through rapid communications, and also have viewpoints and commentaries. So it's both to advance the scientific record of interventional radiology and citations and visibility, but also to be able to provide things that you're going to want to browse through and see while looking at a print journal.
Yeah, I think I'm next. Is that right?
Go ahead, John. I think we lost Monica. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think Monica's muted. Yeah, I think this is welcome to the reality of virtual meetings, everybody. So, John Kaufman, I'm also delighted to be here. It's a great panel. I'm going to learn a lot as well. And the TVIR is a very different kind of journal than the JVIR. It's not a peer-reviewed journal, so this is an important distinction between JVIR and, say, TVIR. The goal of the journal is to have team-based quarterly publications on very practical issues or topics for interventional radiology. And it varies all over the map. Some of these are very straightforward, standard kinds of topics, and others are cutting-edge topics. It just really depends on the mix of people who come forward to guest edit. There are two editors, myself and Jim Beninati, although Jim Beninati is going to be stepping down. And I'm really pleased to tell everybody that Janice Newsom is going to be the other co-editor for the journal going forward, starting in January. And essentially this works by the editors think of what might be good topics at meetings, listen to what's current, see who is doing what, and also receive suggestions from individuals who are interested in guest editing, and then put together the editions for the next year or so. The guest editors are primarily responsible for guiding through the whole editorial process. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you can learn as a guest editor, recruiting authors, editing, having a vision for an issue. So the bottom line is non-peer reviewed, very topic, practical, focused articles, not, it's something that's meant to be kind of useful, things you can refer to in the middle of the night when you need to learn how to do something.
Great, thank you. And I found my microphone. Why don't we go to Dr. Ray next?
Well, thanks, Monica. So it turns out nobody really wants to hear me, but nobody wants to see John, so I win. So I'm currently the editor-in-chief of Seminars and IR. I've been there since 2012. Seminars is much more similar to TVIR than it is JVIR. It is also a topic-driven review journal where each issue we pick a topic like portal hypertension, or the next one coming out is liver cancer, and focus specifically on 8 to 15 articles just on that topic. 100% review. In addition to the topic-driven articles, though, we also do M&M series. We do clinical corners where might have a hepatologist, for example, talk about portal hypertension. We have trainees corners as well. But just like TVIR, we are not peer reviewed, and we don't accept or rarely accept uninvited articles. So we also have guest editors who are luminaries in the field of that particular topic, who elicit authors from the IR community or elsewhere. We have a kind of a rotating schedule of things that we think are particularly important that need to be revisited every 4 or 5 years. I guess that's it. And again, like the others mentioned, I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Great, thank you. And we'll go to Dr. Pyne next.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me as well. I am editor of IR Quarterly, or IRQ as it's affectionately known. This is a little more obviously informal of the publications that we're talking about here. This is more of SIR's newsletter. It was originally started as a bi-monthly newsletter called IR News. Even before that, before my time, it was a SCBIR's SCBIR News. And it was really essentially announcements from the SIR and the SIR Foundation and division and committee updates. But in 2011, as the society grew and so many people sort of wanting information, it really sort of launched into something what we should formally know now as IR Quarterly. And what it is besides just news and announcements, it's a lot of feature articles, editorials. It really, it talks more about practice management and who we are. There's recognitions, there's, things about, the most recent articles about COVID. And now it's really starting to expand more and more as we grow into, clinical opportunities, pearls, practice management tips, really any other topic of interest for the SIR community and IR community in general. So we're advancing now more obviously into the electronic space with the eIRQ. One of the most important things is that, this is really sort of open to everybody. So if somebody has something that they're interested in speaking about or really sort of, talking about, they can submit an article to the print publication or eIRQ. We really have a lot of RFS members who are on it right now. They're on the editorial board. And we also are really sort of spearheading a podcast called The Kink Wire. So really this is sort of a way to, spread and network with each other and share information. And again, I'm very proud to be on this as a panelist on this talk. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then we'll have Dr. Klein go.
Thank you, Monica. This is Jeff Klein. I want to thank you for including me in tonight's webinar. So I'm hoping that most of your listeners will know that RadioGraphics serves as the RSNA's peer-reviewed education journal, and we are in our 40th year of publication. It began in 1981 as a brainchild of a radiologist who wanted to leverage some of the education content that was presented at the RSNA annual meeting and invited for peer review and publication in the journal to serve as an educational resource for the RSNA members. I've served as editor of Radiographics since 2011, and actually at the end of this year, in 2020, I'll be stepping down and I'll be succeeded by Dr. Cookie Menyas, who's an abdominal radiologist at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. Radiographics, as you probably know, focuses on the educational content that is presented at the annual meeting each year. And our mission is essentially to provide the entire subspecialty spectrum of material for lifelong learning and self-assessment for RSNA members and those who read our journal. Obviously, interventional radiology is one of many components of the journal, and over the years we have always had an editorial board member or members now who have a background in interventional radiology, and we certainly look to publish high quality review articles on those topics in interventional radiology that would be of interest to RSNA members.
Thank you all very much. And then, from now, I have some list of questions as well, but, from now on, you all can also, self-moderate if you want to chime in. I'm happy to make this informal. So the next question we'll start off with is, how do you recommend trainees or early career professionals approach learning from your publications specifically? Are there any tips or tricks, specific habits we can build that you recommend that we do, such as signing up for a specific newsletter or just reading articles that your periodical publishes.
I'll take a shot at that one. I mean, in the most early training phase, it's important to sort of build a base, you know, like training for climbing a mountain. And that's first polishing off some books and reading on topics for things that you're seeing. Because diving into papers, especially alone, is a pretty challenging thing. I mean, try reading another journal's papers without that base, and I'm lost very quickly. So, for example, when we do a journal club, there's always background reading as well. So assuming that that background is built, then it's topical reading. And if you can create a reading group, which is essentially a journal club, then, you know, at least for me, I tend to think more consistently and more effectively in groups. So online learning has become the method of journal clubs. Ours are now online. Probably everybody's doing the same. There's no reason that we can't start to interlink these things. And then you create a habit of how to think about journals, not just summarize them as happens in many journal clubs, and start to think critically. And the next step from that is to say, do you want to step into reviewing and partnering with a mentor who's going to teach you how to translate that type of thinking into formal submission of critiques? And I suppose that certainly JVIR as a peer-reviewed journal provides opportunities for people at a very early stage when partnered with a senior mentor, have to know who that is, but can submit reviews. So there are kind of stage-wise ways to dip into this depending on how your brain works in IR.
Yeah, Ziv, I'm glad you brought up the review thing. I think that's really important way to get started. And I know there's varying levels of when people can get in, but that's not something that TVIR or seminars can offer at the trainee level. I'm not sure about radiographics, but that's I think a really key. You learn so much by thinking about an article that way. And I know, Ziv, you just conducted a fellows course, or a editorial fellows course, which is more at the attending level. But looking for those kinds of opportunities at every level are very important.
You threw me a ball, and if I can pick that up, because when I was a first early assistant professor, I was specifically told by somebody that I shouldn't waste my time doing reviews. The answer is, if your time is a fixed quantum, and you'd be writing a paper instead, but who really lives that way? There's always some crime drama to watch instead. So in the process of reviewing, if you can partner with somebody and deliver a review that's useful to the journal, otherwise you don't get asked again. It's really merit-based reviewing. But if you partner with a senior mentor and say, look, I can get this assignment, this journal will let me do it, but you've got to read it with me, and we've got to talk about it together, and then you form a local network with that person, then that's something that becomes a useful thing. And to John's point about that week-long editor's fellowship, a lot of people do this, but I have been holding nearly monthly online journal clubs focused on manuscript writing and teaching to nearly 1,000 people. It's the Editor's Writing Club. And that is a real gap in academics. Chuck, you're a chair. How do you see other departments and also your own trying to teach people who are going to publish or perish how to get this skill? And therefore, how does that trickle down to students? Does anybody do it, or how do you kind of get them there?
So first of all, kudos to you, Steve, for starting the program that you have. I actually think that reviewing is, as you and John both said, is actually vital, not because you necessarily learn something particularly about that paper that you've just read, but because it allows you to be a better reader of the literature and allows you to be a better author. And only by critiquing others' works, or often by critiquing others' works, we start to learn that skill set for ourselves. You also mentioned mentoring. I think that's vital. Sponsoring is even better. Finding somebody who has the time and effort and is willing to put the effort into kind of taking you as a reader, a writer, and a reviewer to that next level. So a lot of it is still on the job training. I don't know if that's right, wrong, or whatever, but there aren't a whole lot of programs out there other than JVIRs that I'm familiar with. I think AJR has a program as well. I'm not sure, Jeffrey can talk about radiology and radiographics if they do the same, but a lot of it really is hooking up with a faculty member, senior faculty member in your department.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on that. This is Jeff. And it's true that actually all of the RSNA's journals, not only radiology and radiographics, but actually our new online journals, all offer mentoring opportunities for residents, usually senior residents and fellows, who have decided on a subspecialty and want to gain some experience from a seasoned mentor on how to critically review, whether it be a research article or obviously in the case of radiographics, a review article. In addition to that, one of the things that all the journals are now engaged in is actually developing trainee editorial boards. So if you look at radiology, radiographics, and the online journals, we all have an in-training editorial board where we have residents who apply in a competitive fashion for these positions. They are mentored in all aspects of scholarly publishing, whether it be writing, creating abstracts, video podcasts, visual abstracts rather, and also creating sort of excerpts or short podcasts or little small editable pieces of content that describe sometimes very complex research articles or very detailed educational articles in a way that's really easily accessible and you can listen to in a short period of time. So I think that's just another opportunity where residents, early career professionals would have an opportunity to engage in one of the journals.
Great, and then I actually have a question for Dr. Pyne. I mean, this is all really interesting from a trainee perspective. There's a lot out there that we don't know about. But for IR Quarterly, it sounds like there are, it's not just publications or educational topics. We have news and podcasts and lots of information, and sometimes it can be information overload. So are there specific areas of IR Quarterly that you feel like we should, as trainees, focus in on, or how to find what interests us most?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, because there is so much information coming at you, and now in today's age, it's hard to get the right information. So I think our Quarterly does a really good job of really sort of explaining that. We have, in part of our Quarterly is actually to summarize some of the latest breaking articles, and again, not to simplify it too much, but really to sort of send it to JBIR or the other or radiographics or wherever these articles are coming from to really explain them. So I think JBR IRQ does a really good job of sort of breaking those things down to smaller nuggets. For the most part, again, this is more of a editorial and sort of features based publication that really is shining a spotlight on what is the current pulse of IR. What's important there. We're actually taking a new stance right now. It's going to be the first one coming out. We're actually doing more of a technique and topic-based thing called a supplement. We're doing it in PAD. The reason we're doing that is really sort of a lot of people have certain interest in certain areas that we, besides just sort of taking the research-based approach, is more of, I think, more of the seminars and TBR way of taking it and sort of simplifying it, I think, and really giving a nice sort of a broad base, I think, for a lot of people in the most up-to-date way. So I think it's very helpful to have that. And I guess the best way that I think of it is our Quarterly, I think, fills in a lot of the gaps there from a lot of the other scientific journals on the panel here.
So if I may, there's a theme that we heard from Jeff and from Raj and from all the panelists, which is we're all actively working on some sort of knowledge translation, because we may have our core content, but we realize that people want to digest it in different ways at different times, whether it's creating the synopses or the podcasts that we heard about or otherwise. We have an Access blog, and a plug for the Daughter Institute, the editor for this JVR Access that's had almost 300,000 hits. A lot of things are written by trainees under Professor Huber, who's now looking at. But all these journals have these different bites that you can read at and potentially also move into as contributors as well, because you've heard that we're all looking for people to both read and write these things, and those are great entry points.
Yeah, that is a good point, and I think the importance of finding a research mentor as well is sort of the next step for engaging with these publications and for getting more involved in research. All right, well, the next, I mean, this sort of goes back to what we were talking before, and I guess I can start with Dr. Pyne as far as are there specific hot topics in the IR community or trends from different parts of the world that you've noticed in, gathering all the information that you do in IR Quarterly and sort of distilling it down for the readers?
Yeah, we keep everything open in IR Quarterly, and I would be remiss to not give a big shout out. I mean, the SIR staff does an amazing job, and that's Brian Hapes and Hope Racine. So they do, 95% of the work. They're amazing in that. And to be honest with you, we don't limit it to anything. So we have practice management, where we really spotlight people's practice management. The latest one obviously has been on COVID and how our practice is managing. Because as good as, we always talk about as good as you can be as an IR, if you, as a private practice, if you can't make enough money to keep the doors open, it doesn't matter how good you are at clinical practice. So I think, the tips and tricks have been amazing, because as much as, we always talk about is, between the practice management or not, I always say, if you ask 10 different IRs about a technique or how to do something, you'll get 11 different answers. And, my trainees always say the same thing, that they're not sure how to go. So, how do you go about getting that information? And I would say, you're going to have to look at seminars and TVAR, and then the data you're going to have to get. We're a nascent field. We are not backed by a lot of data yet. And that's why I think it's amazing how we're getting all that, information out from JVAR. At every journal club we do, it's a new topic comes up, and, it's fascinating to see, what people have thought about for many years, and all of a sudden what the data is bearing out. So I think it's amazing to have that. Completely off topic, but going back to what we're talking about there. But, honestly, we're completely open. I think the, JVR, IRQ is really sort of the pulse of what we're doing. So we're sort of seeing where we are, what topics are coming in. I think one of the main areas we get a lot of the up-to-date topics is SR Connect. I don't think years ago when we started SR Connect, we had any idea that it would sort of be this own living organism. And, we take a lot of the topics that are there and then sort of make those into more formal topics. So that's really sort of where we look at it. We have no agenda. We have no other way except for our editorial board. And that includes a bunch of our current RFS, members who will, really help and guide us where we need to go.
For Dr. Klein, from a IR education standpoint, are there any, hot topics or specific areas of focus that you all have been publishing recently that you know of?
Thanks, Monica. I'm, I think, smart enough to know what I don't know. And so, as is the case, I would think in any journal that publishes such a broad spectrum of subspecialty content like RadioGraphics does, and again, this holds true for radiology as well, we engage experts in interventional radiology to help us to define what the interesting topics are. And essentially, again, our focus at RadioGraphics is what is presented at the RSNA annual meeting. So, there are usually a few hundred exhibits in each of the various subspecialties. We have 2 editorial board members who themselves have a group of about 15 to 20 interventional radiologists, and they in turn look at the educational review articles, and they tell me what the hot topics are, and then we basically invite those topics for submission to the journal, and those undergo peer review, and then obviously we publish typically 1, perhaps 2 interventional radiology articles in each of our bi-monthly issues of the journal. So I don't know that there's any particular topics I wouldn't profess in the midst of such an illustrious group of interventional radiologists to tell you what the hot topics are. We basically rely on our experts to tell us what those are, what topics we should be focused on. That would appeal again to both the subspecialty trained interventional radiologists, but I think also radiologists who perhaps do some procedures, biopsies, whatever, but perhaps they're not even fellowship trained, but they still have some interventional radiology responsibilities. And so we try to offer something for the subspecialists, but also for the general radiologist who might have to, delve into the various subspecialties that perhaps they don't have specific fellowship training in.
Thank you. And Dr. Kaufman, from a techniques perspective, are there things that the community seems especially interested in currently, or that you think that us as trainees should be, focusing on learning more about right now?
Yeah, Monica, that's again, a great question. I almost feel like the same answer as Dr. Klein. I mean, there's so much out there. It's hard even for those of us who've been in this for a while to keep track of things. I think our latest issue is on ablation. We really try and focus on practical kind of approaches. So I think it really depends on what you're interested in, what you're going to get out of this. So I think I would let your curiosity drive what you go after, to be honest. And I think in terms of going forward, we're always interested to know what people want to hear about. We periodically have an issue focused, say, on call issues or other things that would be very relevant at the resident level. But I think every issue has relevance at the resident level.
Monica, this is Jeff. If I could just chime in for one moment and follow up on something that John just said. I think one of the things that those of you who are in training or early career should be aware of is that many organizations, many societies, journals will make it clear what it is that they're looking for. For example, again, I'm speaking based on my experience with the RSNA, but each year we have a call for abstracts, and specifically for the journal, we indicate to our authors, our potential authors, those who would consider submitting abstracts, what the topics are that our readers want to see, because we get that feedback from them in our surveys and from the CME exercises. And then we have a large group of individuals who review those abstracts, and they're looking for the content that our readers and our editorial board members tell us are important for us to publish in the journal. So it's really useful to look at the calls for abstracts and also just pay attention as to what the journals or the societies which you might be presenting your education exhibit at are looking for. And if you have interest and expertise in those areas and some support from a senior member of your department or mentor, then you can sort of focus on something that perhaps is more likely going to be accepted for presentation and perhaps invited for publication.
All right. Thank you for all of your input. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add, this brings up an interesting point. If I was a trainee and I have a project that I'm working on, maybe I guess this will be to Jeff and Ziv. At what point would you say, maybe I should submit this IR study to RadioGraphics versus JVR and vice versa? And at what point would you as an editor say, maybe this is best for my journal as opposed to the other journal? Is there something specifically you would look at and say it might be best for us or somebody else? And I'm just wondering, as a trainee, I think that's a lot of people would wonder where they maybe should send that study.
You're asking us to lift up the editorial curtain and show you what happens behind that Wizard of Oz thing. Boy, that's a big ask. Honestly, this is a little bit like market timing, but maybe the theme that we're hearing here is the journalistic aspect of the science. In other words, there is a timely interest in certain topics that come and go, and trying to guess is balanced against the quality of the research. So I'd probably roll it back, because if we're talking to early authors, the best advice that I can give you is that when you pick your mentor, go and Google them and see how many first author papers they've written that aren't ancient. Because what you're really vetting is their ability to read that market, to understand what is journalistic, and also to get you across the line with a project, and somewhere along the way to figure out, in stage gates, whether we're just not getting the data, how do we construct the project so that we don't, if it's retrospective, go back 7 times to the records to pull more details, and then write a paper that already has a target journal and is going to be sketched out and shelled out even before the data is filled in. And that means that you're tying yourself to somebody who has a proven track record. And if you do that, then most of the things that we're talking about are not problems that trainees necessarily have to solve, because this is the golden rule. People have done it for all of us on this call, and we're going to do it for them. And you just need to find that person. And you can have multiple mentors. You know, one of my first papers was sketched out by a co-intern that I had who on the phone after I was terrorized for 2 days of staring at a blank page, not knowing where to start. He's an ophthalmologist. He kind of read out a structure of the paper and lights went off and I say, oh, this is something that can be learned. So you can have mentors outside of radiology as well and not just the scientific ones. And I'd kind of connect yourself rather than trying to be the, you know, to sort of discern the touchstone of the paper of the journal at the moment.
So if I can just answer that question that you posed as far as RadioGraphics is concerned, it's actually a relatively straightforward answer. We invite from the annual meeting the education exhibits that we feel our readers want to see most in the journal. And so you can submit a proposal to the editor to be considered, but 90% of what we publish is coming from the RSNA annual meeting. So if you want to be published in RadioGraphics, your best bet is to try to get an abstract accepted for the education exhibits at the RSNA annual meeting. And then in turn, all of our exhibits are reviewed by our subspecialty panels, and then they make the recommendations as to which of those are going to be invited for submission to the journal. Obviously, it really helps to pay attention to what's been published in the journal. And again, if you have local expertise or a lot of experience in a particular disease or procedure, and you know that that's something that probably hasn't been published, or at least published as extensively as the experience you have locally would suggest, then that's a really good opportunity to submit something that's probably going to be accepted and hopefully will be invited for the journal because it hasn't been published. Like another paper on, I hate to say it, prostate artery embolization or things of that sort, unless there's something unique about it, it's probably not going to fly in 2020, 2021. But perhaps there's some other procedure that you have a vast experience with that hasn't been published or considered, and that's really an opportunity to submit an abstract on that particular material.
Yeah, Monica, can I piggyback onto what both Jeff and Zeev said? And first of all, I couldn't agree more with what Zeev said in terms of finding the appropriate mentor. And really becoming a scientific or a review author takes practice. And you're not going to hit a home run with your first article, and you shouldn't expect to. The first article you write is going to take a month. The second article you write is going to take 3 weeks. The third, and eventually you kind of get to be a better author. You're better at reviewing the literature. You're better at digging out the articles that are appropriate and timely. You asked a question though about, what are the hot topics right now? And I don't mean to be snide, but I think they're all hot right now. Every article that comes out in any of these journals is timely, because everything that we've done, if you go back to biliary interventions, as a specialty, we've been doing that for 40 years, but there's always some sort of advancement, whether it's an advancement in the technique, whether it's an advancement in the type of individual in whom we perform the procedure, or the type of pathology, or there's always, it's an iterative learning process, and it's something that IR is absolutely special in, that everything that we do advances incrementally and in pretty quick order. So, when John and I talk about the review articles that we solicit, if you were to pick up an aortic intervention from TVIR from 6 years ago and then look at the latest iteration of that, all the references are going to be different. The entire article is going to be different. And on the surface, you kind of go, well, it's just another stent graft article. No, not true. Not true at all. There's too much advancement in our field to sit back and look at a paper that's 2, 3, 5 years old. It just doesn't make sense.
I think that's really important to keep in mind for trainees that, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel and come up with everything on our own, that we obviously have a lot of resources available to us and mentors to guide us in picking, topics and creating an outline. So I think that's excellent advice from all of you. And then, also going along with the topic of not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but in bringing IR to lower resource communities, and especially since this is a international outreach committee webinar, and some of our attendees may be from lower resource communities or where may not necessarily have specific IR pathways. But have you noticed any push for research from areas or countries, communities that don't have, you know, quite the resources that some of the larger U.S. cities have. And if so, what have you seen, or what do you have what recommendations do you can you give? And then I will plug, before we have anyone answer that, for all the attendees to please submit any questions you may have. This will be open to, you know, your Q&A after this. So I guess we can start with Dr. Pyne, since I think there's a lot of input from the global IR community for IRQ.
Yeah, in terms of how to reach it, it's a publication for anybody who is an SR member. So if you are an SR member, you should be getting that. I don't know exactly as to how internationally the main publication goes out, but now we have EIRQ. So if you go to that website, which is sirweb.org /IRQ, it is open source. So that is all the information I think is available to everybody. So I think it's very critical to have that information available to everybody, and it's really just a great way to as a soundboard to get everybody up to date on the topics that are really cutting edge to IR. So I think it is readily available to anybody who's interested.
Hey, Monica, it's John. Oh, well, Zeev, go ahead.
No, go ahead after you, John.
Yeah, this is a really important topic, and I think one of the things that we tend to get fascinated with is these really complex, expensive toys for doing very specialized kind of procedures. And thinking about intervention, image-guided intervention, the impact it can have in a global sense, in some of the most useful, important things we do are the most basic things that we all kind of take for granted and think of, oh, it's just the stuff we have to get to so we can then do that really complex portal vein reconstruction. Part of the one way of thinking about this going forward is the mechanics of healthcare delivery. So it may not necessarily be what particular procedure you want to sort of see how it plays out in a particular environment, but as you alluded to, how does image-guided intervention get delivered in these different venues across the world? And that's actually important, everybody, to understand how that happens, because even within highly developed countries, there are areas in the country that healthcare delivery is very compromised, and understanding how it's done globally becomes important. So when people are thinking about topics and international things like that, this is a really great area for healthcare policy, healthcare process, healthcare delivery kind of topics. None of which would really fit for TVIR, to be honest, but more a plug for JVIR.
This is Jeff. If I can just follow up on that. I think that's a really important point to realize that we tend to be very North American focused in much of what we do, whether it's technology or I would imagine in the IR realm. When we look at content for radiographics, it's really important that since we have a large component of our society that are international members, about 30% of the 50 some odd thousand members of the RSNA are from non-North American facilities. They also need education, and they need, information that will help them establish themselves in radiology and interventional procedures. And we really look carefully at the applicability of some of what we publish and how it is received, not just at the large institutions that we're all working at and familiar with here in the US, but also worldwide. And a good example would be, and I'm going to plug one of the articles that we have in our current issue, but I was pitched an article on peritoneal dialysis catheter placement, which, is probably not a hot, sexy topic, but it was something that wasn't really presented at the annual meeting, probably because I would imagine it's not quite as hot and sexy as some other things that are done. But, worldwide, renal dialysis and renal failure are huge issues, and cost and maintenance are issues. And this is an article that our, editorial board members felt was really important, not just here in the US, but also just worldwide, a procedure that can be performed relatively easily that could really benefit patients, whether they're here in North America or elsewhere. So, I mean, I think these are really important things to consider when you're trying to decide what to publish and what type of review articles to put in your journal.
I guess I'll add to the themes that have been mentioned. I would echo the necessity of making sure that the science is applicable at all levels, and also trying to signal that we both want to be able to reach from JVIR into first, second, third world growing IR practice, both for readers and also for education. So journals send messages very different ways, and you've heard all the editors talk about it. So JVR, for example, has global perspectives. There's been a JVR Beacon program, which to me is sort of a mission to give out free electronic subscriptions to people who raise their hands. The problem is how do you get this group over here to raise their hand and know that this is available? So the challenge is, so the types of efforts like AID and the other radiology and SIR programs that kind of put people together, and suddenly the light goes off and people start to say, we'd like this thing, and then we can be reading locally. So that's some of the challenge, is the ground networking creates the opportunity for the content to be delivered. The writing groups that I mentioned are freely available. And the last one, I had people from 4 different continents, people getting up at 2 in the morning. In other words, there are resources if you can make them work for you. I have things that are translated into Chinese to make it available as well. Now there's a team of 17 authors in China who every month translate the abstracts and then go up sort of a journal change as well. So all these journals have these things. The question is, how do you kind of make it clear to everybody in consolidated fashion that they're out there? And if you ask, you can get more than you may realize. Maybe that's the big message from here. Maybe that's the big take home, is some sort of resource page that you put together where we just make all these things visible to people in one place so they can ask.
Yeah, thank you for that and all comments you've had. Dr. Ray, you had something else you wanted to add?
No, I'll just be brief. It's interesting when we all talk about the globalization of IR, I think we tend to be very parochial about it. And I'm the worst, I'm worse than most with this, and that, thinking, well, what can we bring to the world in terms of IR techniques and technology? Well, it works both ways, right? I mean, all you need to do is go to China and talk about chemoembolization and realize that you are the most junior person in the world, and everybody you're talking to has 10 times the experience and probably 10 times the success that you do. So globalization of IR is not Americans, North Americans, whatever, going out and teaching the world how to do things. We've got a lot to learn from the global community as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Did any of the other editors have additional comments related to this question? I was going to give us the 45-minute warning bell. Okay, well, thank you for those comments. And then there are a few questions that we have that are related to some of the things that you've talked about as well, but maybe you may have additions or things you want to elaborate on. So I will read those questions, but also at the same time, I want to remind the audience, if you have questions as well, please type into the question box and I will get to those and try to read them as well. So going to the first question, I know we started talking about academic publishing a little bit and also kind of making it more available or building awareness among the global community and internationally. So do you have any advice for IMG specifically who are looking to get into academic publishing? Was one of the questions. I know you had mentioned the like the journal clubs for each of the different journals that sometimes you hold, but I didn't know if there was any other advice that you may have for someone who's
the first thing to remember that for IR specifically, there are a lot of country-specific journals. There's an Indian journal, there's a Pan-Arabic Society journal. The editors of these journals are top quality editors who have published in all leading journals as well. So they are looking for content. That's the struggle with a starting journal. So the bar to entry and the ability to also to speak to your national or continental audience, it's a great opportunity and it's an easier opportunity as well. So that's a great place to be looking.
And also one thing that I think I was really fascinating that I got from the discussion today is that sometimes I think from a trainee perspective, like it seems like research is purely like when there's a cohort study or like a randomized controlled trial, because that's what we're taught about the most in academic medicine. But I think from the panel, what we're also hearing too is that there's a lot of educational and publishing that's not directly research studied like that. Whereas, you know, you've given examples where there's focus on different techniques on how physicians or clinicians can build their skills. And there's some really, it doesn't have to be like a hot, sexy topic, but it could be a very global and important topic that can be of a focus. So I think that was a fascinating, you know, point too that I'm seeing from the panel, that it doesn't just have to be like a research design study that happens over time. But I don't know if that helps answer that question as well, but it was just something that I observed. And then the next question is, what approximate percentage of your authorship or contributions come from international authors for your journals?
You can start with that if you'd like. This is Jeff. I'd say about 30% of our content that we publish comes from international authors. And this is pretty much the makeup of our society and also the mix of educational material that gets presented at the annual meeting. So it's about not quite a third of our content. And I would say it's an increasing percentage. I would venture to guess that for most of the journals, I know for radiology, certainly the majority of the material, research articles that are published in radiology, for example, are coming from outside North America. But for education journals like RadioGraphics, I think that the percentage is still mostly North American, but an increasing percentage of international authors submitting, presenting, and doing a great job, frankly, with writing up their material and with translation.
Did any of the other editors have comments for that question as well?
For JVR, the majority of submissions, over half, come from the US. But beyond that, submissions from every continent, from all over Asia, from all over Europe, from sub-Saharan, from India, subcontinent as well. So biggest part certainly is the US, to 50% to about 65%, it varies. But there's no bias against the research. For example, there's certain types of things that simply are done more abroad, as Dr. Kaufman had mentioned, which means that's the pipeline for that kind of research. So I think I can speak for all of the editors, which is that we are blind to the authors of good quality science. There's no bias for or against if the quality of the research is good. So you're not behind the curve in any sort of way by pedigree.
Mm-hmm.
One cautionary note that I thought might be worth mentioning is that sooner or later, we're all going to get blitzed in our emails by asking us to be editors-in-chief, editorial board members, or submit our journals, our articles to these journals. And there are hundreds and hundreds of predatory journals. You can look them up. And these are basically scam journals that will charge you to publish your paper. And at worst, if you become, quote, an editor because you think that this elevates you, in fact, you've given your good name and credibility to a scam journal and won't be able to subtract it. So use your proper clinical skeptic's mind in terms of these journals and offers like this as well.
Good warning. Okay. And then the next question, let me read this one. So can anyone comment on the importance of engaging with and or publishing in journals from like a community IR's experience, not just an academic IR?
So
yeah, I think that's really important. And, you know, we don't have enough articles. I think the challenge is many of the academic practices have a little more support and time for writing articles. And so it's, for many people in the community, it is a true labor of love to take the time out to put together articles and write them. But this is critical. This is where the majority of IR actually happens, is in, quote, the real world. So articles that reflect that are really important, you know. And again, I'm just speaking in general editorial terms, but you know, I would encourage people to try and put together those kinds of articles. And often the experiences in terms of volume are huge in the community compared to the academic centers.
So I
would throw in one. I'm sorry. I would throw in one cautionary note, and that is that just because you do a lot of any type of procedure doesn't mean you necessarily write about it. And this is getting back to like Steve's fellowships. It's, you know, you go, well, I can write, I do this procedure, so I should be able to write a scientific article or review article or whatever, and that's not necessarily the case. Scientific writing and good writing actually takes practice. So just because you do something and you do a lot of it doesn't mean you can write it up in a coherent way that's going to actually educate other people. And that's getting back to having a good mentor. Even if your first opportunity or 10 opportunities are not in the area in which you want to really develop your own reputation, it's better to get some, you know, some papers under your belt with a good mentor. Even if it's in an area that, okay, you know, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to put it aside. You've got to practice, and scientific writing takes practice.
So I'll jump in there too. I mean, as opposed to a lot of the co-panelists, for my first few years, I mean, my practice, I was a private practice, and we become hybrid as I have trainees now in IR. But for the most part, you know, my plight is very different. You know, I wasn't that interested in academics. I wasn't that interested in research. I only did it as a trainee because I thought it would look better for my resume. The interesting part is then you go to private practice and you start doing something, you have patients, and you start realizing that you do something every day and that there are so many fascinating clinical questions about whether you're doing it the right way. I totally agree with that. And, you know, it's amazing how quickly you can get into the same habit of doing something because that's the way you habituate to it. And now it's very interesting that as I've gone to private practice and spent a lot of my time, you know, in private practice, that now I realize that, you know, research is unbelievable. If you get the chance, the opportunity, which is actually, I tell you, most people in private practice, it's very challenging. You know, being clinical 5 days a week and then at the same time taking your time off to put the research together is hard. But at the same time, I'll tell you, my vein practice, you know, I do thousands of the same procedure every year. I started noticing patterns that I haven't seen other places. So it's taken me some time, but I'm writing up articles or research studies that have, you know, really high numbers that you probably wouldn't be able to get in other places because, you know, you're doing a very specific part of a practice. So I think it's a great question. I think it's very challenging in private practice, not only just to do research, but to even keep up with the literature. I think it's very challenging to, you know, we have in our practice, we have a journal club where our docs get together and discuss these things because, you know, it's not easy to stay up. There's so many incredible articles coming out every single month. Just to follow that is a behemoth, you know, endeavor. So I think it's a very big challenge. But that being said, it's not impossible. And, you know, as IR grows, I think it's so critical to be able to analyze these articles yourself, you know, take the information from them and say, this is something that's going to change my practice or not change my practice. And on the flip side, if you're in private practice, take that time once in a while to say, you know what, the information I have, the numbers, the data that I have, the expertise I have may be something that could change other people's practice. And so you need to take that time and actually, you know, put that research together. And I think it's going to be valuable for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think earlier in the discussion, like one of the beginning questions was kind of how can trainees use these resources or like keep up with the literature. And it sounds like, you know, it's going to be different at the trainee level versus y'all at the attending level. And Dr. Haskell had mentioned for the trainees, it's really important to get that foundational background knowledge. But do you all have, there was like a question related to this. So that's a great segue. Let me read it directly. It says, reading academic journals can sometimes be intimidating, knowing where to start, especially with the lack of background experience. what's the best way for a younger IR trainee to onboard to your journal, and what's the best way to use it to like supplement learning? Or, you know, maybe you can also kind of talk about how, you know, as a trainee you went about it and how it's transformed as you know, been in your IR practicing role more, and how that learning transition changes. I don't know if anyone's.
I can't remember that far back, but I'll take a shot at pretending I can. You look at a JVR paper and you can go to the penultimate paragraph in any lab or clinical research and read the limitations. And the limitations are actually a sign of strength by the authors, because they're saying, I'm the content expert on this topic. This is what I'm going to do next, but let me show you how this research does or doesn't advance things, what the gaps are or otherwise. So it's also an insight into methods and into reading backwards. If there's a commentary, read the commentary. If there are period articles, read two. If you're reading a new paper, go to seminars or go to RadioGraphics or go to TVIR and read the review article that goes along with it. In other words, pair the base, you know, whether so that you've got two things. And now you're reading two journals. And then there's sort of the habit of saying, this thing makes sense. We looked at the acetobeva papers, bevacizumab papers this week in a multi-ED journal club, and everybody had basic reading on immunotherapy as well, because you can't just launch into Lancet New England Journal without at least some background, or at least try to hold your end up. So all of these journals that we're talking about together provide bases for each other's papers and places to read as well. And maybe that's kind of the kumbaya aspect of how to take this on from the people you've pulled together tonight.
This is Jeff. I think one of the things you see as a trend in almost all journals, medical journals, not just radiology journals, is that they almost all have a component that's primarily online that is geared towards medical students, residents, fellows, people in training. And I know, again, for the RSNA journals, each of them has a component that basically does, takes the content and tries to provide it in a format that can be consumed. And frankly, it's not just for members in training. I would argue that those of us in practice who need to perhaps do something outside of our particular subspecialty area of expertise turn to these podcasts or these visual abstracts or these, in a minute reviews to try to have a translation as to what the science is telling us. And even the educational articles need to be sort of, put into a format that can be easily consumed. So I think this is a trend you see in the New England Journal, you see it in JAMA, and you certainly are starting to see it more and more in radiology journals, where even though you may not be a subspecialty trained radiologist, you can absorb the information in a variety of formats, recognizing that we're appealing to people in a broad spectrum of experience and training, broad spectrum of expertise, and this is something that we need to do in order to allow people to learn in the fashion that they're most comfortable.
Yeah, I would say everyone learns in a different way. There's so much information that's available, but I think we all learn in some ways similarly, in that repetition is really helpful, right? So it's like learning a language or learning how to play an instrument. You've got to keep coming back. So don't think that you've read one article, you've got it all. You don't need to ever look at this again. You should keep coming back. And each time you come back, you'll learn more will stick. In the IR world, it can be very procedure driven. You just see, what am I going to be doing tomorrow? And let me just read up on this. And the first time you read some very entry level basic kind of articles, and then the third or fourth time you're really beginning to delve into the randomized controlled trials that are really informing maybe some of the treatment decisions. So it's think of it like, again, learning a second language or an instrument. You just got to keep going back, and you'll build on each time. You build a little more.
Okay, and then there's one final question before we wrap up for tonight. So it's asking, so as someone starting out in their IR career, they're wondering, was becoming an academic journal editor always a professional goal, or is that something that kind of happened by chance and based on the mentors you had?
For me, complete chance.
Yeah.
Complete chance. I was asked to take an editorial role in CVIR out of the blue, and it was a giant piece of work at the time, and I did it for 5 years and learned a lot, and somehow the next. So anybody can learn this stuff.
Yeah, I would say that for most of us, probably those of us who are older like myself, probably isn't something we really thought about when we were in training early in our career. But I think very much like anything, whether it be to become an editor or you want to be a chair or obtain a leadership role, nowadays more and more there are ways to train and prepare for those sorts of roles that just don't happen by happenstance. And so I think for most of us, again, speaking for myself, it wasn't something I ever thought about, but it was something I thought I enjoyed and thought I was decent at. But I think it is something that I think many younger radiologists that I'm familiar with, they do have an interest in becoming more involved with journals and publishing. And so there are career pathways now, mentoring programs and experiences for members in training that allow them to get the experience that they need, perhaps to eventually join an editorial board and perhaps become a journal editor.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's all of the questions. I don't know, Monica, did you have anything else you? No, okay, and the panelists don't either. Okay, well, me and Andy are very, very thankful for all of you being able to come tonight and gather. And we really appreciate you sharing these thoughts with us, and maybe we will reach out about those other opportunities that international medical trainees can also learn about finding a way to become better writers. And also, we really want to thank you all for being amazing educators. I know for like radiographics, even on the DR side, in radiology training, they have the blueprint series for core practice, like for core building knowledge, and that's a lot of image-rich imaging. It's free and available online, so even international readers can access that. And we also really thank, the Dr. Haskell, Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Ray for contributing content from their journals that are part of the radiology essentials, or let me read it. What is it? The residency essentials in SIR. So the content from these journals are kind of parsed in a way for us trainees to understand when we have access to that. So we may not be able to read the journals directly and be able to comprehend everything, but it's been curated in a way that we can become better learners from that. So we really appreciate you all being willing to contribute to that. And most of this I wouldn't have known without having read IR quarterly. So it's just really nice to get a highlight of everything. So thank you all for joining us tonight and sharing with us. And we hope you all have a good night, and thanks for making this possible.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks for having
Thank you
us.
so much.
Thank you, Monica.